If about 40 minutes from now, you and I were in the Bartlett room enjoying a cup of coffee and probably some goodies, if I had an opportunity, I would probably turn and ask you, tell me about your Christmas. And then there would begin to come all the stories that even asking that question begin to run around in your head, just like they do in mine. Christmas is a time of joy with family and friends getting together again. A season in which we open greetings from friends often distant that we haven't seen in the past year, but who convey blessings for us and wishes for a good year, and perhaps tell some of their story. We will have had experiences in music which has touched us deeply, sometimes with joy, like the Christmas jazz we had here, and sometimes because of the carols we sing or the anthem of the choir, or music we've heard on our recordings at home or on the radio. We begin to hear again that story told in song, and it has a way, as music does, of touching us at some deeper level in our lives, so that we begin to resonate and respond to that. Christmas, if I asked you about your Christmas, you might describe me trips you took, old friends you were with. And yet, if I probed a little deeper, if we had just a few minutes more, you would begin to perhaps share with me some of the other pieces of Christmas. The fact that when we gather as families, there is often an empty place in that circle. Perhaps a new empty place this year because one we have loved and cherished isn't with us. Or remembered losses in our lives of grandparents and parents and spouses and children, grandchildren, dear friends. So Christmas isn't just a time of joy, it's a time of loss remembered, isn't it? And then there come those other alternating feelings that we have. We gather here for Christmas jazz concert, and in the midst of that are reminded that it's a benefit because there are some desperate for fuel this winter. We collect socks in great numbers to send to Portland. We share warm coats. We try in our own way to be part of God's answer, but somehow those issues, especially at Christmas, seem so enormous. And then there's that downside of our family experience. Had you noticed that things are not always smooth with families? Yeah, we all laugh because that's a story we all know only too well. We see the adolescents and young adults in our families struggling to find their way in the world, and sometimes that's a bumpy way for us. Sometimes we hit the point where there has to be a reset on what we've done at Christmas before, and suddenly those adult or growing to adulthood at whatever stage they are, they resist the changes. They would rather have us continue to do all the work. Oh, that caught somebody, didn't it? And just resetting those patterns is really painful for many of us. And all that is set against what I would call the larger framework, not only of the fact that our society in the last few years hasn't done well in distributing equitable incomes so that our children and grandchildren are struggling in ways that seem harder than what most of us went through. And in the midst of that, there's often a lot of conflict and alienation and pain that comes into our lives when we're with them over Christmas. And then there's that big world out there, a world of fighting in Syria, which has caused hundreds of thousands of refugees. And they're running out of food because the money in the World Food Program is inadequate because the gifts haven't been coming in to meet that need. And we hear the stories of in eastern Nigeria how the Islamic extremists have come in and kidnapped nearly 100 young women and children to take into slavery. Or we see the continued fighting in the Middle East around Syria and Iraq. That's the world. Terrorist attacks in Paris this week. Speculation of what it means for us. Welcome to the real world. But I'd remind you that that isn't new. I mean, if we really read the story of the first Christmas, it's a pretty grim time. Mary and Joseph. Mary with an unexpected pregnancy, Joseph wondering what to do, but still takes Mary and goes on that journey to Jerusalem. We've had a few pregnancies. How would you like to be caught on the road, stuck in a donkey, when you're close to the due date, huh? And when you get to Bethlehem, there's no resting place in the inn. There's no place for you to go. And so you end up in a cave where they usually keep the animals in the winter. And there doesn't talk about obstetricians, doesn't talk about delivery rooms, doesn't talk about pain medication. It says that there they struggle to deliver this child, wrapped him in what clothes they had brought, and his first cradle was the feeding trough. You think we got trouble. And then the angel message comes to whom? To shepherds in the field, the most destitute and impoverished in that society. And then there's this strange scene 3 with wise men, magi, probably astrologers and priests who came from a region where they believed that the stars would predict events. And they arrive in Jerusalem, coming hundreds of miles through the worst desert in the world in order to try and discover what it means that in that portion of the sky that was called the house of the Hebrews, there was a new star that told them there was one who was born who would lead that nation. And so they come, and when they arrive in Jerusalem, Herod is frightened. His power is none too secure. He uses violence to maintain his position. And now he's told that there is another one who is announced as the new king who will replace him and his dynasty. So he calls the wise men in and he says, go find the baby so that I can go and welcome him too. But all the time, he is working with his army to surround the region of Bethlehem and to kill all the boy babies under 2 years of age when they thought the star had first appeared. That was the first Christmas. How about for us? What happens to us when it comes to Christmas? We are filled with these conflicting emotions of hope and then disappointment, wishing that our families, our friends, our world would be different, and here we are, and it seems that in spite of candles in the windows and decorations on the trees and the retelling of the story, that too much of it all sounds like the same wishful thinking. And yet there's that yearning in us all that it might be true, that God would come to our world and offer healing and hope in ways that could change, if not our circumstances, that change us as we face them. Because that's what Christmas is really about. It's not a baby who was born in a manger and born in a stable and laid in a manger. It's about, as in the words that are described as Emmanuel, God with us, that it is God, the power that is at the very source of all of life itself, is the source of creation and all that we see and know, that power is entering our world in a new and dramatic way that can bring about transformation for us and the people we are. That story, that hope was brought home to me at one moment in my life in a very dramatic way, and though it's not connected with Christmas, it's everything about God's presence in our lives, which is what Christmas is about. It was a winter Sunday in 1946 when I was 12 years old. The war in the Pacific had ended in August, and the servicemen were beginning to come home. Our church had a tradition that from time to time, at least every month or 6 weeks, there would be a layperson who would come from the pews and offer a word of witness or testimony as a part of the service. If those of you used to watch the Hour of Power with Dr. Schuller, that was always part of what he did every Sunday. There was somebody who came up and did that. Well, on a Sunday early in January of 1946, when I was worshiping in church there in Haddonfield, New Jersey, at that point in the service, a young Marine in his dress blues came from his place in the pew and came up to stand beside the pulpit. And his words were something like this. When I was growing up, I always felt the sense of God's presence by being here, my church. This is where my family worshiped, and that was our place in the pew. And I connected a sense of God's presence with what happened here, with sermons that touched my heart, with music by the choir, with scriptures that were read. Especially in those seasonal times, somehow, Christmas Eve and Easter morning have a way of getting us at a different level in our lives, don't they? And yet he said, I discovered that when I was halfway around the world, surrounded by violence and death, I felt God's presence closer to me than ever before in my life. And then he grabbed from his pocket a little New Testament with the Psalms, opened it to a place he had marked, and began to read. O Lord, you have searched me and known me. You know when I sit down and when I rise. You surround my path and my lying down and are acquainted with all my ways. There isn't even a word on my tongue, but you, Lord, you know every one. You have surrounded me, behind me and before me, and have laid your hand upon me. Where could I go from your spirit? Where could I flee from your presence? If I could rise to heaven, you're there. If I take my place with the dead, behold, you're there. If I ride the wings of the morning and dwell at the farthest end of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me. If I say, surely the darkness will hide me, and everything around me is black, yet even that darkness doesn't hide me from you. For darkness and light are both alike to you. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my thoughts, and see if there is any wicked way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. Then he closed the New Testament and went down to take his place. God's presence for him and for most of us is so often associated with what happens when we're here. This is sometimes when that awareness is deepened as we grasp life more as it really is. And yet, far from home, from all things familiar, surrounded by the death and dying of his buddies, one by one beside him, he found God closer to him than ever before. Well, that's what Christmas is about. That God has come to our world, to our hurting, to our despair, to our sorrow and our grieving, and have said that you're not alone. In the midst of the darkness, there's a light shining that indicates that God's presence is with you and that you can follow. It may not make any change in the circumstances that we face, but it can change us so that we are God's people, faithfully knowing where our lives are connected in the midst of whatever comes to us. That's good news. That's wonderful news. That's news that Christ is present with us in our world. And the miracle is that when we tell the story, it happens again. That's why we tell the Christmas story. That's why we sing the carols. That's why we gather in praise. Because they are reminders again telling us of where our lives are connected. in spite of tragedy and sorrow and death itself, we know whose we are. We are God's people. That's worth celebrating. Thanks be to God.